The Courageous class consisted of 3 battlecruisers known as large light cruisers built for the Royal Navy during World War I. The class was nominally designed to support the Baltic Project, a plan by Admiral of the fleet Lord Fisher that was intended to land troops on the German Baltic coast. Ships of this class were fast but very lightly armoured, with only a few heavy guns. They were given a shallow draught, in part to allow them to operate in the shallow waters of the Baltic, but also reflecting experience gained earlier in the war, to maximize the speed. The Courageous class battlecruisers were the first capital ships of the Royal Navy to use geared steam turbines and small tube boilers. The first 2 ships, Courageous and Glorious, were commissioned in 1917 and spent the war patrolling the North Sea. They participated in the Second Battle of Heligoland Bight in November 1917 and were present when the High Seas Fleet surrendered a year later. The half-sister Furious was designed with a pair of 18-inch guns, the largest guns ever fitted on a ship of the Royal Navy, but was modified during construction to take her flying off deck and hangar in lieu of her forward turret and barbette. After some patrols in the North Sea, her rear turret was removed and another flight deck added. Her aircraft attacked the Zeppelin sheds during the Tondern raid in July 1918. All 3 ships were laid up after the war, but were rebuilt as aircraft carriers during the 1920s. Glorious and Courageous were sunk early in World War II and Furious was sold for scrap in 1948. Design and description. The first 2 Courageous class battlecruisers were designed in 1915 to meet a set of requirements laid down by the First Sea Lord, Admiral Fisher, with his Baltic Project in mind. They were to be large enough to ensure that they could maintain the speed in heavy weather, have a powerful armament and a speed of at least 32 knots to allow them to outrun enemy light cruisers. The protection was to be light for a cruiser, with 3 inches of armor between the waterline and the forecastle deck, anti-torpedo bulges amidships and the machinery as far inboard as possible, protected by triple torpedo bulkheads. Shallow draft was of the utmost importance and all other factors were to be subordinated to this. The Director of Naval Construction, Sir Eustace Dennis and Danecourt, responded on the 23rd of February 1915 with a smaller version of the Renown-class battlecruisers with 1 less gun turret and reduced armor protection. The Chancellor of the Exchequer had forbidden any further construction of ships larger than light cruisers in 1915. Sir Fisher designated the ships as large light cruisers to evade this prohibition. If this restriction had not been in place, the ships would have been built as improved versions of the preceding Renown class. The 2 ships were laid down a few months later under a veil of secrecy, so they became known in the Royal Navy as Lord Fisher's hush-hush cruisers, and their odd design also earned them the nickname of the Outrageous class. The half-sister Furious was designed a few months later to meet a revised requirement specifying an armament of 2 BL 18-inch MKI guns, the largest guns ever fitted on a Royal Navy ship, in single turrets with the ability to use twin 15-inch gun turrets if the 18-inch guns were unsatisfactory. Gunnery experts criticized this decision because the long time between salvos would make spotting corrections useless and reduce the rate of fire, and thus the probability of a direct hit. Her secondary armament was upgraded to BL 5.5-INCH MKI guns, rather than the 4-inch guns used by the first 2 ships, to compensate for the weakness of the 2 main guns against fast-moving targets frigates like destroyers. Her displacement and beam were increased over that of her half-sisters with slightly less draught. The Baltic Project was only one justification for the ships. Admiral Fisher wrote in a letter to the DNC on the 16th of March 1915, "I've told the First Lord that the more that I consider the qualities of your design, of the big light battlecruisers, the more that I am impressed by its exceeding excellence and simplicity. All the three vital requisites of gun power, speed and draughts are well balanced." Quote, "In fact, they could be considered the epitome of Fisher's belief in the paramount importance of speed over everything else." Fisher's adherence to this principle is highlighted in a letter he wrote to Churchill concerning the battleships of the 1912-13 naval estimates. In the letter, dated April 1912, Fisher stated, "They must be sacrifice of armor. There must be further very great increase in speed. Your speed must vastly exceed your possible enemy." Fisher's desire for a shallow draft was not merely based on the need to allow for inshore operations. Ships tended to operate closer to deep load than anticipated and were often found lacking in freeboard, reserve buoyancy and safety against underwater attack. This experience led the DNC to reconsider the proportions of the hull to rectify the problems identified thus far. The Courageous class ships were the first products of that re-evaluation. General characteristics. The Courageous class ships had an overall length of 786 feet 9 inches, a beam of 81 feet, and a draft of 25 feet 10 inches at deep load. They displaced 19,180 long tons normally and 22,560 long tons at deep load. They had a metacentric height of 6 feet at deep load and a complete double bottom. The half-sister Furious was the same length, but had a beam of 88 feet and a draft of 24 feet 11 inches at deep load. She displaced 19,513 long tons at load and 22,890 long tons at deep load. She had a metacentric height of 5.33 feet at deep load. Propulsion. To save weight and space, the Courageous class ships were the first large warships in the Royal Navy to have geared steam turbines and small tube boilers, despite the latter's significantly heavier maintenance requirements. Furthermore, to save design time, the turbine installation used in the light cruiser Champion, the Navy's first cruiser with geared turbines, was simply doubled. The Parsons turbines were arranged in 2 engine rooms and each of the turbines drove one of the 4 propeller shafts. Furious's propellers were 11 feet 6 inches in diameter. The turbines were powered by 18 Yarrow boilers equally divided among 3 boiler rooms. They were designed to produce a total of 90,000 shaft horsepower at a working pressure of 235 psi, but achieved slightly more than that during Glorious's trials, although she did not reach her design speed of 32 knots. They were designed to normally carry 750 long tons of fuel oil, but could carry a maximum of 3,160 long tons. At full capacity, they could steam for an estimated 6,000 nautical miles at a speed of 20 knots. Armament. The Courageous class ships mounted 4 BL 15-inch Mark I guns in 2 twin hydraulically powered Mark I** turrets, one each fore and aft. These turrets were originally intended for a Revenge-class battleship that was cancelled shortly after the war began. The guns could be depressed to -3 degrees and elevated to 20 degrees. They could be loaded at any angle up to 20 degrees, although loading at high angles tended to slow the gun's return to battery. The ships carried 120 shells per gun. They fired 1,910-pound projectiles at a muzzle velocity of 2,575 feet per second. This provided a maximum range of 23,734 yards with armor-piercing shells. The Courageous-class ships were designed with 18 BL 4-inch Mark 9 guns, fitted in 6 triple mounts. These were manually powered and quite cumbersome in use as they required a crew of 32 men to load and train the guns. The guns' rate of fire was only 10 to 12 rounds per minute as the loaders kept getting in each other's way. They had a maximum depression of -10 degrees and a maximum elevation of 30 degrees. They fired a 22-pound high-explosive shell at a muzzle velocity of 2,625 feet per second. At maximum elevation, the guns had a maximum range of 13,500 yards. The ships carried 120 rounds for each gun. Each ship mounted a pair of QF 3-inch 20 hundredweight anti-aircraft guns on single high-angle Mark II mountings. These were mounted abreast the mainmast in the Courageous-class ships and before the funnel on Furious. The gun had a maximum depression of 10 degrees and a maximum elevation of 90 degrees. It fired a 12.5-pound shell at a muzzle velocity of 2,500 feet per second at a rate of fire of 12 to 14 rounds per minute. They had a maximum effective ceiling of 23,500 feet. All 3 ships carried 10 torpedoes and mounted 2 21-inch submerged side-loading torpedo tubes fitted near a turret. They were loaded and traversed by hydraulic power, but fired by compressed air. The 18-inch BL Mark I gun carried by Furious was derived from the 15-inch Mark I gun used in her half-sisters. It was intended to be mounted in 2 single-gun turrets derived from the twin-gun 15-inch Mark I turret, and her barbettes were designed to accommodate either turret in case problems arose with the 18-inch gun's development. But only one turret was actually fitted. The gun could depress to -3 degrees and elevate to a maximum of 30 degrees. It fired a 3,320-pound 4CRH armor-piercing capped shell at a muzzle velocity of 2,270 feet per second to a distance of 28,900 yards. It could fire 1 round per minute and the ship carried 60 rounds of ammunition. The turret's revolving mass was 826 long tons, only slightly more than the 810 long tons of its predecessor. Furious' secondary armament consisted of 11 BL 5.5-INC HMKI guns. The guns had a maximum elevation of 25 degrees on the pivot mounts. They fired 82-pound projectiles at a muzzle velocity of 2,790 feet per second at a rate of 12 rounds per minute. The maximum range was 16,000 yards at 25 degrees elevation. Fire control. The main guns of the Courageous-class ships could be controlled from either of the 2 fire control directors. The primary director was mounted above the conning tower in an armored hood and the other was in the foretop on the foremast. The secondary armament was also direct-controlled. Each turret was provided with a 15-foot rangefinder in an armored housing on the turret roof. The foretop was equipped with a 9-foot rangefinder, as was the torpedo control tower above the rear superstructure. The anti-aircraft guns were controlled by a simple 2-meter rangefinder mounted on the aft superstructure. Protection. Unlike on other British battlecruisers, the bulk of the armor of the Courageous-class ships was made from high-tensile steel, a type of steel used structurally in other ships. The waterline belt consisted of 2 inches covered by a 1-inch skin. It ran from barbette to barbette with a 1-inch extension forward to the 2-inch forward bulkhead well short of the bow. The belt had a height of 23 feet, of which 18 inches was below the designed waterline. For the forward barbette, a 3-inch bulkhead extended out to the ship's side between the upper and lower decks, and a comparable bulkhead was in place at the rear barbette as well. 4 decks were armoured with thicknesses varying from 75 to 3 inches, with the greatest thicknesses over the magazines and the steering gear. After the loss of 3 battlecruisers to magazine explosions during the Battle of Jutland, 110 long tons of extra protection was added to the deck around the magazines. The turrets, barbettes and conning tower were made from crop-cemented armour. The turret faces were 9 inches thick, while the sides ranged from 7 to 9 inches in thickness, and the roof was 4.5 inches thick. The barbettes had a maximum thickness of 6 to 7 inches above the main deck, but reduced in thickness to 3 to 4 inches between the lower and main decks. The conning tower armor was 10 inches thick and it had a 3-inch roof. The primary fire control director atop the conning tower was protected by an armored hood. The face of the hood was 6 inches thick, its sides were 2 inches thick, and its roof was protected by 3 inches of armor. A communications tube with 3-inch sides ran from the conning tower down to the lower conning position on the main deck. The torpedo bulkheads were increased during building from 75 inches to 1.5 inches in thickness. All 3 ships were fitted with a shallow anti-torpedo bulge integral to the hull, which was intended to explode the torpedo before it hit the hull proper and vent the underwater explosion to the surface rather than into the ship. However, later testing proved that it was not deep enough to accomplish its task, as it lacked the layers of empty and full compartments that were necessary to absorb the force of the explosion. Ships service. During her sea trials in November 1916 off the River Tyne, Courageous sustained structural damage while running at full speed in a rough head sea. The forecastle deck was deeply buckled in 3 places between the breakwater and the forward turret. In addition, the side plating was visibly buckled between the forecastle and upper decks. Water had entered the submerged torpedo room, and rivets had sheared in the vertical flange of the angle iron, securing the deck armor in place. The exact cause remains uncertain. The Courageous received 130 long tons of stiffening in response. Glorious did not receive her stiffening until 1918. Courageous also was temporarily fitted as a mine layer in April 1917, but never actually laid any mines. In mid-1917 both ships received a dozen torpedo tubes in pairs, 1 mount on each side of the main mast on the upper deck and 2 mounts on each side of the rear turret on the quarter-deck. Courageous and Glorious served together throughout the war. Both ships were initially assigned to the 3rd Light Cruiser Squadron and later reconstituted the 1st Cruiser Squadron. Even as she was being built, Furious was modified with a large hangar capable of housing 10 aircraft on her forecastle, replacing the forward turret. A 160-foot flight deck was built along its roof. Aircraft were flown off and, less successfully, landed on this deck. Although the aft turret was fitted and the gun trialed, it was not long before Furious returned to her builders for further modifications. In November 1917 the rear turret was replaced by a 300-foot deck for landing aircraft over another hangar. Her funnel and superstructure remained intact, with a narrow strip of decking around them to connect the fore and aft flight decks. Turbulence from the funnel and superstructure was severe enough that only 3 landing attempts were successful before further attempts were forbidden. Her 18-inch guns were reused on the Lord Clive-class monitors General Wolfe and Lord Clive during the war. All three ships were in the first CS, of which Courageous was flagship when the Admiralty received word of German ship movements on the 16th of October 1917, possibly indicating some sort of raid. Admiral Beatty, commander of the Grand Fleet, ordered most of his light cruisers and destroyers to sea in an effort to locate the enemy ships. Furious was detached from the 1st CS and ordered to sweep along the 56th parallel as far as 4 degrees east and to return before dark. The other two ships were not initially ordered to sea, but were sent to reinforce the 2nd Light Cruiser Squadron patrolling the central part of the North Sea later that day. 2 German Brahma-class light cruisers managed to slip through the gaps in the British patrols and destroyed a convoy headed to Scandinavia during the morning of the 17th of October, but no word was received of the engagement until that afternoon. The 1st CS was ordered to attempt to intercept the German ships, but they proved to be too fast and the British ships were unsuccessful. Second Battle of Heligoland. Over the course of 1917, the Admiralty was becoming more concerned about German efforts in the North Sea to sweep paths through the British-laid minefields intended to restrict the actions of the High Seas Fleet and German submarines. A preliminary raid on German minesweeping forces on the 31st of October by light forces destroyed 10 small ships, and the Admiralty decided on a larger operation to destroy the minesweepers and their escorting light cruisers. Based on intelligence reports, the Admiralty decided on the 17th of November 1917 to allocate 2 light cruiser squadrons. The 1st CS covered by the reinforced 1st Battlecruiser Squadron and, more distantly, the battleships of the 1st Battle Squadron to the operation. The German ships, 4 light cruisers of 2 scouting force, 8 destroyers, 3 divisions of minesweepers, 8 spar breachers and 2 trawlers to mark the swept route, were spotted at 7:30 a.m. silhouetted by the rising sun. Courageous and the light cruiser Cardiff opened fire with the forward guns 7 minutes later. The Germans responded by laying an effective smoke screen. The British continued in pursuit, but lost track of most of the smaller ships in the smoke and concentrated fire on the light cruisers as opportunity permitted. One 15-inch hit was made on a gunshield of SMS Pillau, but it did not affect her speed. At 8:33, the left-hand gun in Glorious's forward turret was wrecked when a shell detonated inside the gun barrel. At 9:30, the 1st CS broke off the pursuit so they would not enter a minefield marked on the maps. The ships turned south, playing no further role in the battle. The German ships had too much of a lead to be caught by the British ships before they had to turn to avoid the minefield. Both ships had taken minor damage from their own muzzle blasts, and Glorious required 5 days of repairs. Courageous fired 92 rounds of 15-inch while Glorious fired 57, scoring only the single hit on Pillau between them. They also fired 180 and 213 4-inch shells respectively. Courageous's mine fittings were removed after the battle, and both ships received flying-off platforms on top of the turrets in 1918. A Sopwith Camel was carried on the rear turret and a Sopwith 1.5 strutter on the forward turret. Furious was recommissioned on the 15th of March 1918, and her embarked aircraft were used on anti-Zeppelin patrols in the North Sea after May. In July 1918, she flew off 7 Sopwith Camels which participated in the Tonde Erne raid, attacking the Zeppelin sheds at Tonde Erne with moderate success. All 3 ships were present at the surrender of the German fleet on the 21st of November 1918. Post-war history. Courageous was reduced to reserve at Rosyth on the 1st of February 1919 before being assigned to the gunnery school at Devonport. The Following year as a turret drill ship, she became flagship of the Rear Admiral commanding the reserve at Devonport in March 1920. Glorious was also reduced to reserve at Rosyth on 1 February and served as a turret drill ship, but succeeded her sister as flagship between 1921 and 1922. Furious was placed in reserve the 21st of November 1919 before beginning reconstruction as an aircraft carrier in 1921. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 required the signatory nations to severely curtail the plants for new warships and scrap many existing warships. To meet its tonnage limits, up to 66,000 long tons of existing ships, however, could be converted into aircraft carriers, and the Royal Navy chose to convert their Courageous-class ships because of the high speed. Each ship was reconstructed with a full-length flight deck during the 1920s. The 15-inch turrets were placed into storage and later reused during World War II for HMS Vanguard, the Royal Navy's last battleship, as the first large Ork fleet carrier completed by the Royal Navy. Furious was extensively used to evaluate aircraft handling and landing procedures, including the first ever carrier night landing in 1926. Courageous became the first warship lost by the Royal Navy in World War II when she was torpedoed in September 1939. Glorious unsuccessfully hunted the Admiral Graf's P in the Indian Ocean in 1939. She participated in the Norwegian campaign in 1940, but was sunk by the German battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau on 8 June 1940 in the North Sea. Furious spent the first months of the war hunting for German raiders and escorting convoys before she began to support British forces in Norway. She spent most of 1940 in Norwegian waters making attacks on German installations and shipping, and most of 1941 ferrying aircraft to West Africa, Gibraltar and Malta before refitting in the United States. She ferried aircraft to Malta during 1942 and provided air support to British forces during Operation Torch. Furious spent most of 1943 training with the Home Fleet, but made numerous airstrikes against the German battleship Tirpitz and other targets in Norway in 1944. She was worn out by late 1944 and was reduced to reserve in September before being decommissioned the following year. Furious was sold in 1948 for scrap.